Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we record videos that we hope help you to turn yourselves on to some great theories of everything from the past, ancient and modern, mostly obscure, and things that you can use in every aspect of your life, things that you can believe in. We hope that they'll help you with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, and your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. Today is our 25th video that we've done reading the book called It's After the End of the World. Don't you know that yet? And this is a history of a couple of relatively underground jazz musicians in Chicago in the mid-20th century, and explains their quest to kind of redefine themselves. No longer are we entertainment or artistic musicians, but we are articulating a spiritual purpose and something that you can believe in all cases. And we are kind of in the epilogue, unpublished epilogue. And this is just our second day on the epilogue, and he's just getting into as a result of studying these musicians who are trying to redefine their profession, is proposing a definition of the author's profession, which is history. Okay, for many years of my research, I conducted a mysterious practice that attempted to intuit these habits by putting a clock structure within an undifferentiable matrix. This timed breathing exercise or competition, along with the history class, were my initial forays into professional history, to be the messenger or runner into an unprecedented understanding of change over time, which is how history is defined. At least, they teach you that in grad school and stuff. In both ways, I have proven the end of history and the urgency of the historian to do something else in order to put the calendar and the daily schedule in order. This proof required ignoring flack and ridicule from several different quarters. Luckily, I had a long history of doing this by necessity. As I researched this topic, I studied literally hundreds of mystical, occult, esoteric, New Age, and many of them worked by themselves, but the tree was the structure, the filing cabinet, the cosmogony that enabled me to integrate the separate strains to get a holistic understanding of the creation. And as the musicians did almost half a century ago, it is time for a professional history to emerge and expose underground techniques, for it is now after the end of the world. More broadly, as humans, being born after the end of the world puts our lives in a high-stakes bracket, so to speak. We have the rare opportunity to bury the old world and give birth to a new one. We are living through the last 4,000 days, and I guess in a revision, it says now 700, and I guess by now it's about minus 4,000. of the 9,360,000 day Mayan galactic cycle, we have outlived revelation. Section 2 is called Growing Up Messed Up. My upbringing can easily be considered privileged, but this term is obviously relative. Many white suburbanites consider their experience to be normal, quote, and something that other people should strive for. If you want to think of it materially or commercially, then probably. But if you want to think along the lines of cultural diversity and artistic exposure, perceptiveness, receptiveness, and creativity, then no, I was impoverished. But really, as everyone, my upbringing was less privileged or underprivileged than novel, unique, and because of that, dysfunctional. As the first and only child of two professional, educated, middle-class black parents, born on their anniversary, I was given an intense amount of personal attention and scrutiny. Given that my parents, especially my mother, was thoroughly dedicated to so-called education, I was given an enormous foundation for school before I started. When I was still 2, I started the first of 2 years of Montessori school before kindergarten. Meanwhile, my mom was drilling me, a la Todd Marinovich, on my multiplication tables, which I knew way before the other students. I did not always blindly follow, but my mother in these early years had a great influence on me. By the time we moved from the city to the suburbs, just after I turned 5, I was so-called helping, the men that we hired to carpet the new house by going around using a tape measure to calculate the square footage of every part of the basement. Since we moved during the middle of my kindergarten year, I stayed at the private city school until the end of the year. The school had to send a van way out to pick me up. I remember often disagreeing with my mother about my clothing selection for the day. In particular, I remember one day secretly packing my favorite pants so that I could take off the ones my mom dressed me in during the long van ride to the next stop. My mother was quite fussy about my clothing. I always wore outfits, no mismatch between tops and bottoms. These outfits were frequently effeminate and provided much grist for the mill of my teenage friends upon looking at my toddler pictures. My mother had this tendency toward a type of effeminate gentility that also manifest in my taking a blue blazer etiquette class, figure skating lessons, I was the boy with the white skates on, and golf and tennis lessons. Not to mention 10 years of classical piano. My mother's attempt to get me cultured reached its height in my classical piano lessons, which started very early. I had my first piano recital at 5. Piano lessons epitomize many of the complicated issues that played out in the all-white suburban milieu that I was now living. These issues, ironically to my mother, cut directly against her black female conceptions of raising a male child. My piano lessons, like my childhood pictures, were a source of amusement for and ridicule from my manly white male jock friends. In my new neighborhood, a high premium was placed on competition at the expense of art, and this was fine with me, for I loved playing sports and hated piano. I looked with anticipation of hearing the Saturday noon neighborhood siren, which meant that my music lesson was over and that I could go down the street to the neighborhood football, basketball, or baseball game, which was often being held up to wait for me. My father, and to a lesser extent my mother, was quite naturally in favor of the sporting culture of our new suburb, but even he was distressed by its excesses, which can be seen in any number of our experiences with organized sports and recreation. In this suburb, many of the houses had large yards designed for outdoor field sports and driveways designed for basketball. Children were frequently seen playing outdoors and had little to fear of drug dealers, kidnappers, or muggers. Parental fears came from more subtle influences, including the intense competitive fervor that neighborhood parents impressed upon their kids. Baseball practice started in 4th grade, but by that time I had already been playing competitively for years. The suburban lawns of the neighborhood were all dedicated toward ad hoc or even permanent conversion into a playing field. Many yards had playing field boundaries landscaped or engineered in. Improvised baseball games were always played on smaller fields with tennis balls or wiffle balls, on small lawns or in tennis courts, or even indoors with puff balls, flimsy plastic bats, and a TV screen for a strike zone. At least the TV was off. Little League baseball, like the other kids' sports, was given an undue emphasis. Many parents came to the games and encouraged their children to the point of pressuring them. Parents would even root against the opposing children. My father was an avid spectator of these games, but I cannot remember him indulging in any of those personal parental excesses. Still, evidence can be seen from the fact that my father reminded me of the incredible relay throw I made as a 9-year-old left-handed shortstop to cut down a speedy base runner at third base. I personally only dimly recall the play, but my dad was able to jog my memory almost 25 years after the fact. Nevertheless, although I was an excellent outfielder, I recall having a mediocre arm, a fear of inside fastballs, and an inability to hit the curve. Baseball was fun for me in pickup games, but I didn't much enjoy the organized game, although I did end up playing varsity baseball my senior year in high school. By that time, I still could not hit, but I knew to keep the bat on my shoulder and drew walks over 50% of my plate appearances. From 4th grade Little League, I had to wait for another year for Bucketeers Basketball League. To me, basketball was a much more interesting high-speed game that was also much easier to practice alone and indoors. Moreover, our yard was much more advantageous. My father was as enthusiastic. He told me stories of his exploits as a college player at J.C. Smith College in Charlotte, North Carolina. More important, he used his domestic skills to create a hoops environment in the yard. My dad went beyond our neighbors who had hoops in their driveways by building a larger court for me in the backyard. Countless hours of solo practicing and playing with my friends were logged on that court. Even more, on cold or rainy days, I was able to practice or at least play or at least fantasize as I played on my mini hoop in my room. As I got older, I was able to go to the local YMCA and use their gymnasium. Sometimes I played my fantasy games there. Due to these opportunities, I began to glorify basketball. Before my first year of organized play, I'd already become the star of my fantasy league team, for whom I was also the play-by-play announcer. I learned this technique, no doubt, from Eddie Doucette and Rod Luck, the announcers for the pro and college teams in my town. The Bucketeer League was also quite influential on my understanding of sports competition. I was on one of the best teams, and there was a high premium placed on winning and losing in this league. We had the best player in the league, whose older brother was on the high school team. The games were refereed by 16-year-old kids trying to make extra money, but these teenagers were commonly abused by the overzealous parental spectators. Our star player's father was frequently ejected from games, and sometimes the older brother was kicked out too. Worse, a rival team's father was kicked out of the league for calling the girls on his team and telling them that the game had been canceled so they would not show up. The coach was caught, but undaunted, as he was still angry 7 years later at the parent who reported him and his children. So how can scenarios like this have been created? This last person was a product of a generations-long cycle of vicarious sports worship, where the man was a washed-up athlete who still had unachieved fantasies that he foisted upon his children. The parents, mainly the father, thereby put a tremendous amount of pressure on their kids and then on coaches to win at all costs. Another way that these fantasies were lived out was through televised sports and advertising. Through this larger-than-life model of play, I learned fantasies, field court etiquette, and unknowingly, blindly witnessed all of the subtle ways that I was supposed to idolize corporate consumerism. For me, sports replaced religion as the center point in my life, and God was replaced with winning. These changes occurred subtly in my neighborhood, for during my second grade year, my parents took me out of the competitive, manly consumerist public school and placed me in a more traditional, classically organized private school whose values included the 5 stars: intellect, individuality, character, heritage, and one more that I forgot, and who placed much less emphasis on sports, at least in elementary school. My placement into this elitist private school caused me to get further stigmatized for being even more of a nerd and even a sissy by my friends at the public school. Perhaps this caused me to overcompensate in the other direction, to try to emit an image of macho or at least rebellious competitiveness that was also instigated by my natural abilities in most sports. These rebellious tendencies, already manifest in my clothes changing episode, were perhaps prophesied by my attempt at less than 2 years old to swallow a metal hanger. I had it unraveled and stuck 12 inches down my throat and almost killed myself. Either way, by second or third grade, I clearly felt the need to do rebellious things that adults frowned upon, things that would get you in trouble if you got caught, in order to impress my friends and prove to them that I was as cool as them, even if I did go to the expensive private school. I began to start looking for ways to get into trouble, or rather to find something to get away with so that I could flaunt it to my friends. One clear way to accomplish this was by disobeying my parents or teachers. Some examples included going into forbidden places, which in my house meant going through all the drawers and cabinets in my parents' room and maybe stealing something from them. Or it meant going on journeys beyond my limits, walking or taking my bike across forbidden busy roads, usually to go into stores where I could steal something. Generally speaking, I was pretty good at these daring deceptions. Often what would happen in the same way as a Leave It to Beaver episode or something, I would get away with the deed, but my friend would get caught, implicating me. More often, though, my friend's capture would not implicate me, which contributed to my image as a fearless escape artist, smarter than all adults. It seemed that my mysterious manly, it was later to be called Teflon, reputation for skating, getting away with something, was most in focus when it came to my most memorable exploits: stealing, eating candy, vandalism, and alcohol abuse. These actions, along with flaunting them, seemed to define my identity for more than a decade and cemented the image I had with my friends: cool, regardless of content. Early on, my parents took the advice of the dentists and forbade me from eating sugared candy. This would have been insufficient anyway, since sugar is heavily concentrated in many non-candy foods, especially condiments, such that it is not difficult to abuse sugar without the candy. I would steal money from my parents, usually small amounts, until I learned the technique of stealing large amounts shortly after payday, and take it to buy candy. In searching for the newest candies, I would go on journeys beyond my allowed radius. I collected these candies, I ate a lot of them too, and hid them in my stash, which I kept in my fort in the basement. Somehow, the candies were a source of pride among my friends. Another forbidden item was alcohol. At a young age, my parents would let me have a sip or two of beer, but were clear to alert me to stay away from the liquor cabinet. At first, I may have been scared of these early warnings, but they were demystified when my parents were entertaining company, one of my parents' favorite things to do, and I accidentally took a big swig from what I thought was a pitcher of water, but was in fact a pitcher of martinis. Unaccustomed to the acquired taste of the disgustingly harsh drink, I cringed, but I also survived and surmised that my parents' fears were unfounded. I could handle liquor. By 4th grade, my forays into the liquor cabinet became somewhat common. During the preceding summer, my friends and I got permission to have sleepover parties that were usually held in camping tents we set up in the backyard of the host house. Sometimes we would stay up very late, and sometimes we would lie to our parents and sleep at a friend's house even though the adults were going to be away. These opened perfect opportunities to use my mysterious liquor in larger doses, or the mysterious liquor in larger doses. I clearly remember getting drunk with friends on a number of these events, and I determined it to be an exhilarating event because of the daring it gave me to do even more forbidden things. It also accentuated my reputation as being daring and cool. These sleepover events, especially the ones involving alcohol, also gave us the opportunity to test our military manly mettle through the initiatory ritual of vandalism. Looking back, it appears that the main objectives of our vandalism were to make life as difficult as possible for the suburban adults we tormented, and so we could glorify in the secret knowledge that we had done it. Our vandalism ran the gamut from the rarely successful bombing, moving cars with apples, eggs, and mud balls, and snowballs, to the more promising proposition of bombing houses with eggs or toilet paper, to many more creative acts which were ranked according to their creativity, or rather their destructivity. I do believe there was an unspoken limit here, or a line we would not cross, such as arson or violence to another person, at least at this early age. It was during these sleepovers that our misguided creativity came together. After we set up our tents, and after it got dark, we would go to our respective hiding places where we had stashed our stolen alcohol, which got us warmed up for our later activities, which invariably involved wreaking havoc upon our white middle-class, crime-free subdivision. For some reason, after about 4th grade, however, I basically quit drinking for years, until around 9th or 10th grade, when most of the other kids in the suburbs started. The vandalism continued throughout, though. One favorite activity was raiding gardens. We would scout out the neighborhood candidates beforehand and use flashlights to get the good stuff. Other times we played ding dong ditch, simply ringing the doorbell and running away. How easy and fun. Harder, but even more fun, was using spray paint or shaving cream to write obscenities in strategic places where they could be easily seen. During middle school, I was once caught red-handed writing "fuck you" with shaving cream on a garage door of people I didn't even know. Fortunately for me, perhaps, the person who caught me was young enough to remember his rowdy days. He gave us a stern lecture, made us clean it up, and let us go. Teflon enough for me. Gradually, as we got older and taller, we would maraud around the neighborhoods by car, looking for basketball hoops, which we would attempt to bring down a la Daryl Dawkins. From an early age, I also learned to value acquiring and wearing stolen school athletic department wares. On a number of occasions, my public school friends, not private school friends, broke into the private school and broke into the equipment room to steal gear. I believe we even stole a football helmet, which was highly coveted. My friends from the public school and the kids at the basketball camp were quite impressed with all the stolen stuff I had. In order to keep up the image, I always needed to trump myself, to break more rules than I had the previous time, to flaunt more authority. When I returned to the public school for 10th grade, I made an impression by taking some new friends to the rich kids' school to engineer a massive break-in, which I was never formally charged with, even though my friends were spotted on a number of occasions wearing the contraband. This made me quite nervous, but it also made me quite cool. The escalating vandalism and stealing, however, was certainly a problem, but I do not believe I would have had the guts to engineer some of the atrocities I did in high school without the heavy use of alcohol. As we grew older, this intoxication was also accompanied by fairly large amounts of reckless drunk driving. Naturally, this driving was done in order to get away. At other times, the driving was actually part of the vandalism, lawn jobs to rip up some suburban grass. We also attempted to use our cars as hot rods, donuts and neutral drops in school parking lots, particularly on ice. I even once remember being involved in a drag race. Sometimes, however, the alcohol was not necessary. I was probably even a more reckless driver when sober than drunk. And I remember at least on a few occasions going over 90 miles an hour in a 15-mile-an-hour school zone or 25-mile-an-hour residential area. One time on my way home from playing basketball, all of that adrenaline and competition got me to race my friends in another car to my house. Within 1/2 mile of my house, I was still driving over 85 miles an hour down a residential street. One car backed out, probably looking first and seeing that I was way up the street and not knowing how fast I was going. I had no time to react, and somehow I slid by the car without driving into the ditch. Before I could even gather myself, I had to react quickly again to another car that pulled out from another driveway. As usual, however, I did win the race home, and my friend who was behind me to witness these events got out of the car and said, "You should be dead." And it made me laugh because I was still undaunted. In general, my sheltered life in the suburbs could have been that. But due to all of the images I was entranced by, I found myself always living on the edge, maintaining an identity that was spinning out of control. This even though I was rarely caught, and if I was, it was for a lesser charge. Moreover, if I was caught, it was by school or store officials and not by the police. Nevertheless, this situation was like a volcano getting ready to erupt. The ingredient that often placed me over the edge was sex and romance in the Jim Crow suburbs. In the suburbs, my blackness placed me too far outside the mainstream for me to stay in line. I loved being with girls and I was attracted to very many of them, but instinctively and through conditioning, I could feel that it was inappropriate or taboo for me to approach any of them with any romantic or sexual motives. My best friend told me he thought it was disgusting for people to engage in interracial relationships, perhaps forgetting that there was really only one African-American female in my school for all of my years growing up. I had little choice but to participate in interracial relationships. But I knew that it was not my place to pursue these aggressively. The white girls had to come to me first in unambiguous terms. This was the unwritten rule that I have rarely broken since. I could feel the pressure from white adults and from my peers who assured me that mixed relationships were inappropriate and disgusting if I even thought about breaking these rules. If I took the initiative with any white girl, it would be in violation of our suburban laws or customs. The same rules, I say here, the same rules are still in place in many American communities today. I wrote, this is 25 years old. I don't know that that is still true. I think that taboo has mostly been lifted. I mean, the point that hasn't been said here is that there was really not very much racism that we're talking about here in the 1970s and 80s here in a Midwestern suburb, all-white suburb. The main center of that racism was the relationships with white girls. Most of the other interactions, I didn't feel like there were too many taboos, if any. And maybe even the other way around. So, okay, we're going to stop right there and resume this tomorrow. I guess we're going to get somewhere eventually with this. But thanks for tuning in today.